A pastor's family vanished in 2002 during a prayer retreat in the remote canyons of Colorado. They were never seen again. No rescue, no clues, just an abandoned church van and 13 years of silence until two hikers stumbled upon something, buried in the wilderness, that would finally reveal the truth about what happened to the Michaels family. The morning sun cast long shadows across the red rock formations as Pastor David Michaels adjusted his rearview mirror one last time. In the reflection, he could see his 12-year-old daughter Emma reading her devotional book, her blonde hair catching the early light streaming through the van's windows. 8-year-old Luke pressed his face against the glass, watching the Colorado landscape grow wilder with each passing mile. "Are we almost there, Dad?" Luke's voice carried the restless energy of a boy who'd been sitting too long. "Soon, buddy," David replied, his weathered hands steady on the steering wheel. At 38, he carried the weight of a man who'd spent years shepherding others through their darkest moments. The lines around his eyes spoke of countless hospital visits, funeral services, and midnight phone calls from parishioners in crisis. This retreat wasn't just for his family, it was for his soul. Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. After 15 years of marriage, she could read the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when he thought about the church board meeting that had prompted this getaway. "The canyon cross will still be there in an hour," she said softly. "God's not going anywhere." David smiled at his wife's gentle wisdom. The canyon cross, a towering natural rock formation that early settlers had claimed resembled Christ's crucifixion, had called to him during his morning prayers for weeks. Something about seeking God in the wilderness, away from committee meetings and budget concerns, felt like the reset his ministry desperately needed. The van climbed higher into the Colorado Rockies, leaving behind cell phone towers and the last vestiges of civilization. David had chosen this route deliberately, following an old mining road that promised solitude. What he couldn't have known was that the summer rains had washed out sections of the path ahead, or that the peaceful family retreat he'd planned would become something else entirely. As they rounded the next bend, the road began to narrow. Emma looked up from her book and noticed her father's knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. The fluorescent lights of Mountain View Community Church cast harsh shadows across David's face as he sat alone in his office, staring at the stack of complaint letters on his desk. 3 weeks before the family would disappear into the Colorado wilderness, the weight of shepherding 200 souls was crushing him. "Pastor Michaels?" Betty Hartwell's voice carried through the thin office door, followed by her trademark triple knock. At 72, Betty had appointed herself the unofficial voice of the congregation's concerns, and her visits rarely brought good news. "Come in, Betty." She entered, clutching a manila folder like a weapon. "I hate to bother you, but we need to discuss the youth group's mission trip budget. Some folks are saying $1,500 is excessive for a week in Denver." David rubbed his temples. The same people who spent twice that on vacation criticized spending money to help homeless teenagers. The kids raised most of it themselves through car washes, and that's not the point. Betty's voice sharpened. "People are watching every penny since the Hendersons left for First Baptist. They're asking questions about leadership." The word leadership hung in the air like an accusation. David had lost 3 families this year to the larger church across town, each departure cutting deeper than the last. The Hendersons had been particularly brutal, citing his lack of vision in their goodbye letter. That evening, David sat at his kitchen table while Sarah prepared dinner. Emma was upstairs practicing piano, the same hymn she'd been working on for weeks, while Luke built Lego fortresses on the living room floor. "You're carrying the world again," Sarah said, not looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. "Betty thinks I'm losing control of the congregation. Betty thinks the communion grape juice is too sweet. She's not exactly our target demographic for spiritual guidance." David managed a weak smile. Sarah had a way of cutting through his anxiety with humor, but tonight even her levity couldn't penetrate the darkness settling over his spirit. He'd felt God's call to ministry at 19, standing in a wheat field in Kansas, certain he was meant to serve. Now at 38, he wondered if he'd misheard the voice entirely. "Maybe we need to get away," he said quietly. "Just the 4 of us. Somewhere I can remember why I started this journey. Sarah set down her knife and turned to face him. "What did you have in mind?" The atlas lay spread across the Michaels' dining room table like a roadmap to redemption. David traced his finger along the thin red line that marked Highway 285, following it north into the Colorado wilderness, where few tourists ventured. The Canyon Cross had been calling to him for 3 weeks now, appearing in his morning prayers with the persistence of divine intervention. "It's pretty remote, Dad," Emma said, leaning over his shoulder to study the map. At 12, she possessed an analytical mind that often surprised adults. "There's nothing marked for miles around that cross symbol. That's exactly why we need to go there," David replied, his voice carrying the quiet conviction that had drawn people to his sermons for years. Sometimes God speaks loudest in the silence. Sarah stood in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee, watching her husband plan their retreat with the same intensity he brought to preparing his sermons. She'd seen this look before, the way his eyes focused when he felt heaven pulling at his spirit. It was the same expression he'd worn the night he'd proposed, the morning he'd accepted the call to Mountain View, and every time he'd made a decision that changed their lives. "How long would we be gone?" she asked, setting his coffee beside the atlas. 4 days, maybe 5, just long enough to remember who we are when nobody's watching." Luke appeared at the table carrying his favorite stuffed bear, already excited about any adventure that involved sleeping in the van. "Can we have s'mores?" "Every night," David promised, ruffling his son's hair. "And we'll read stories by flashlight just like camping when I was your age." Sarah studied the map more carefully, noting the elevation changes and the distance between towns. The rational part of her mind catalogued the risks: summer thunderstorms, flash floods, mechanical problems in areas with no cell service. But the part that had fallen in love with a young seminary student recognized the hunger in her husband's eyes, the spiritual thirst that had been building for months. "We'll need to tell someone where we're going," she said finally. "I'll leave our route with Mark," David said, referring to his brother in Denver, "and we'll check in when we get back to civilization." The decision felt right in that moment. Sitting around their kitchen table with coffee growing cold and children dreaming of adventure, none of them could have imagined that their logical planning would lead them into a wilderness that offered no second chances. The Colorado wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction as the Michaels family's van climbed higher into terrain that seemed untouched by human hands. David had been driving for 6 hours, following increasingly primitive roads that transformed from asphalt to gravel to little more than tire tracks carved into red earth. The GPS had lost signal 2 hours ago, leaving them dependent on the forest. Service map spread across Sarah's lap. "According to this, we should see the Canyon Cross Formation in about 3 miles, Sarah said, tracing their route with her finger. The map showed a simple dotted line leading to their destination, but it couldn't capture the reality of boulder-strewn paths and washouts that forced David to navigate around obstacles that hadn't existed when the map was printed. Emma had put away her book an hour ago, mesmerized by the alien landscape outside her window. Towering red cliffs rose on both sides of the narrow canyon, their surfaces carved by millennia of wind and water into shapes that seemed almost biblical. Luke had fallen asleep against his sister's shoulder, exhausted by the excitement of adventure. "Dad, are you sure this is right?" Emma's voice carried a note of uncertainty as they encountered yet another fork in the primitive road. David slowed the van to study their options. The main track curved left toward what appeared to be higher ground, while a narrower path descended into a canyon that seemed to match the topography near their destination. The left fork looked safer, but the right path was more direct according to the map's contour lines. The canyon route should take us straight to the cross, he decided, turning the wheel right. The van's tires crunched over loose rock as they began their descent into the narrow gorge. 20 minutes later, David realized his mistake. The path had grown so narrow that scrub oak branches scraped both sides of the van, and ahead, a recent rock slide had deposited car-sized boulders across their route. When he tried to reverse, the van's rear wheels spun uselessly in loose sand that had accumulated in the canyon bottom. "We're stuck," he said quietly, the words hanging in the air like a prayer that wouldn't be answered. Sarah looked at the steep canyon walls rising around them, at the darkening sky where thunderclouds were beginning to gather, and felt the first cold touch of real fear. The first call came on a Tuesday morning when Pastor David Michaels failed to show up for the weekly staff meeting. Betty Hartwell stood in the empty church office, staring at the untouched stack of Sunday bulletins that should have been reviewed hours ago. By Wednesday, when the family missed Emma's piano recital, the congregation knew something was terribly wrong. Mark Michaels drove up from Denver that same evening, his face drawn with worry as he met with Sheriff Jim Patterson in the Church Fellowship Hall. The room that usually echoed with potluck dinners and children's laughter now buzzed with the urgent conversations of search coordinators and volunteer organizers. "David left me their planned route," Mark said, spreading the atlas across the same table where his brother had planned the retreat just weeks earlier. They were heading to the Canyon Cross area, somewhere around here. His finger traced the thin red line that had seemed so clear on paper, so manageable from the safety of a suburban dining room. Sheriff Patterson studied the map with the practiced eye of a man who'd coordinated searches in Colorado's wilderness for 23 years. The terrain David had chosen was among the most remote and dangerous in the state. A maze of canyons, abandoned mining roads, and geological formations that could swallow a family without leaving a trace. "We'll start with aerial reconnaissance. At first light," Patterson said. "State Patrol's lending us 2 helicopters, and we've got ground teams assembling from 3 counties. By Thursday morning, Mountain View Community Church had transformed into command central for the largest search operation in the region's history. Betty Hartwell, the same woman who'd criticized David's leadership just weeks earlier, now coordinated. Food for over 200 volunteers. The fellowship hall served coffee and sandwiches to search teams, while the sanctuary hosted round-the-clock prayer vigils. The helicopters swept across the wilderness for 5 days, their rotors echoing off canyon. Walls' trained spotters scanned for any sign of the missing family. Ground teams on horseback and ATV explored every accessible trail, calling the families' names until their voices echoed back empty from the red rock formations. On the 6th day, they found David's planned campsite near the Canyon Cross, a clearing. That showed clear evidence of recent use. But the family's van was nowhere to be found, and the tire tracks leading away from the site vanished into hard rock that held no secrets. The theories began sprouting like weeds in the months following. The search's official suspension, in coffee shops and church basements, on internet forums and late-night radio shows, people who had never met the Michaels family constructed elaborate explanations for their disappearance, each more disturbing than the last. Detective Ray Morrison had seen it before, the way unsolved cases attracted amateur investigators like moths to flame. By 2004, his desk was buried under letters from across the country, each containing a new theory about what had happened to Pastor David and his family. The most persistent came from a retired accountant in Phoenix, who was convinced David had embezzled church funds and staged the disappearance to start fresh in Mexico. "Look at the timing," the accountant wrote in his 7th letter, right after that board meeting where they questioned his leadership. He knew they were closing in. Morrison had already verified that the church's finances were clean, that David's personal accounts showed no unusual activity, and that the family's passports remained at home in their dresser drawer. But facts rarely deterred true believers. Thin conspiracy. The cult theory gained traction in 2006 when a self-proclaimed expert on religious extremism published a blog post suggesting that David had been recruited by a secretive Christian sect operating in Colorado's remote wilderness. According to this narrative, the Canyon Cross was a gathering place for believers who practiced a more authentic Christianity away from modern civilization's corruption. "These groups prey on disillusioned pastors," the blogger wrote. "They promise spiritual renewal, then isolate families from the outside world. The Michaels family isn't missing, they're being held." Mark Michaels read every theory, chased every lead, and grew grayer with each passing year. His brother's congregation had split into factions, those who maintained faith that the family would return, those who believed they were dead and deserved proper memorial services, and those who whispered darker suspicions about David's character. By 2010, even Sheriff Patterson had moved on to other cases. The official file remained open, but the active investigation had long since ended. The Canyon Cross area had been searched dozens of times by professional teams and amateur enthusiasts alike, each expedition finding nothing but empty wilderness and false hope. The conspiracy theorists filled the silence with increasingly elaborate stories, but none of them could answer the most basic question. If David Michaels had planned to disappear, why choose one of the most dangerous places in America to do it? Pastor James Keller stood at the pulpit, where David Michaels had once delivered sermons, looking out at a congregation that had shrunk to fewer than 90 members. 5 years had passed since the disappearance, and Mountain View Community Church bore the scars of prolonged grief like an old building settling into its foundation. The empty pew spoke louder than any eulogy. "We gather today not in despair, but in hope," Keller said, his voice echoing in the half-empty sanctuary. At 31, he'd inherited a church haunted by questions no one could answer. His predecessor's family photos still lined the hallway leading to the office, frozen moments of happiness that now felt like accusations. Betty Hartwell sat in her usual pew, 3rd row from the front, but her fire had dimmed to embers. The woman, who'd once criticized every budget decision, now moved through church functions with the mechanical precision of someone going through familiar motions. She'd organized the memorial service 3 years ago, despite Mark Michaels' protests that it was premature. "They're not dead until we know they're dead," Mark had said then, his voice hoarse from years of sleepless nights and false leads. But even he seemed different now, worn down by the relentless passage of time and the weight of carrying hope alone. After the service, Keller found Mark in the fellowship hall, staring at the bulletin board where David's final announcement still hung beneath layers of newer notices. The youth group mission trip to Denver had been cancelled indefinitely. The men's Bible study had dissolved when its leader vanished. The building fund for new carpet had been quietly redirected to basic maintenance. "People ask me if I think they're still alive," Mark said without turning around, as if 5 years should have given me some kind of clarity. Keller had been trained to offer comfort in situations like this, but seminary hadn't prepared him for the particular anguish of unresolved loss. How do you counsel someone whose grief has no endpoint, whose questions have no answers? "The hardest part isn't not knowing," Mark continued. "It's watching everyone else move on while you're still stuck in that moment when the phone first rang, and you knew something was wrong." Outside, the Colorado mountains stretched toward the horizon, keeping their secrets locked in stone and silence. The manila folder labeled Michaels Family 2002 sat on Jim Rodriguez's kitchen table like an old wound that refused to heal. 13 years into retirement, the former Denver detective still pulled the file out on sleepless nights, spreading crime scene photos and witness statements across the surface where his grandchildren usually did homework. Rodriguez had worked hundreds of cases during his 30-year career, but some investigations followed you home and never left. The Michaels family was one of them, 4 people who'd simply vanished into the Colorado wilderness without leaving so much as a footprint behind. The doorbell rang at exactly 2 p.m., and Rodriguez opened it to find a woman in her early 30s, holding a laptop bag and wearing the determined expression of someone who'd spent years chasing answers in other people's cold cases. "Detective Rodriguez, I'm Lisa Chen. We spoke on the phone about the Michaels disappearance." Chen was a data analyst for an insurance company by day and an amateur missing persons researcher by night. She'd found Rodriguez through a forum dedicated to Colorado cold cases, where his username Old Cop New Tricks had been posting theories about the Michaels family for 3 years. "I've been studying this case for 6 months, Chen said, settling into Rodriguez's living room with the ease of someone accustomed to making her own introductions. "There's something everyone missed." Rodriguez poured coffee and studied his unexpected partner. Chen had the focused intensity of someone who saw patterns where others saw chaos, who could spend hours analyzing satellite imagery and topographical maps without losing interest. It was exactly the kind of obsessive attention to detail that cold cases required. The official search focused on the Canyon Cross area because that's where David said they were going, Chen continued, opening her laptop. But what if they never made it there? What if something happened earlier in their journey? Rodriguez had wondered the same thing for years. The searchers had found the family's intended campsite, but no trace of their van. It was as if the vehicle had simply been erased from existence, somewhere between the main highway and their destination. "I've been mapping every possible route they could have taken," Chen said, pulling up a detailed topographical display, "and I think I found something the original investigators missed." For the first time in years, Rodriguez felt the familiar spark of a case about to break open. Rodriguez's home office had transformed into a war room overnight. Maps covered every available surface, connected by colored string that traced possible routes through Colorado's wilderness. Chen sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by printouts of weather reports from July 2002, while Rodriguez studied satellite imagery on dual computer monitors. "Look at this," Chen said, pointing to a section of topographical map where red lines indicated elevation changes. Everyone assumed the family took Highway 285 north, then turned west toward the Canyon Cross. But there's another route, a mining road that branches off earlier. Rodriguez leaned over her shoulder, following her finger as it traced a thin line that seemed to disappear into the map's most remote section. That road's been closed for decades. Why would David choose it? Because he wouldn't have known it was closed. Chen pulled up a scanned image of a 1998 Colorado road atlas, the type that would have been available when David planned his trip. "See? This older map shows it as a legitimate route. It even looks shorter than the main highway." The revelation hit Rodriguez like cold water. For 13 years, searchers had focused on the Canyon Cross area because that's where David had intended to go. But what if the family had never reached their destination? What if they'd taken what appeared to be a shortcut and ended up somewhere completely different? The weather records show heavy thunderstorms in that area on July 24th. Chen continued, shuffling through printouts. Flash flood warnings were issued for all the mountain canyons. Rodriguez studied the satellite images with new eyes, seeing the landscape not as static terrain, but as a dynamic system shaped by water and time. The mining road Chen had identified led into a series of narrow canyons that would have channeled rainwater like a funnel. If they got caught in a flash flood, Rodriguez's voice trailed off as the implications became clear. Chen nodded grimly. The van could have been swept miles downstream, buried under debris where no one would think to look. The original search teams were focused on high ground near the Canyon Cross. They never searched the flood zones. Rodriguez felt the familiar electricity of a case about to crack open. After 13 years of dead ends and false leads, they finally had a theory that explained everything. The family's disappearance, the lack of evidence, and the complete failure of traditional search methods. "We need to get out there," he said, already reaching for his hiking boots. The morning sun cast long shadows across Dead Horse Canyon as Rodriguez, Chen, and 2 volunteer searchers picked their way down the rocky slope. 6 miles south of the Canyon Cross, the terrain told a different story than the peaceful wilderness where David Michaels had planned to seek God. Here, twisted metal and bleached wood marked the high water lines of flash floods that had carved the canyon deeper with each passing storm. Chen stopped suddenly, her GPS unit beeping as they reached the coordinates she'd calculated. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If the van got caught in the flood zone, it should be somewhere in this area." Rodriguez studied the canyon floor, reading the landscape with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades finding what others had lost. 13 years of seasonal floods had moved massive amounts of debris, creating a puzzle of rocks, fallen trees, and sediment deposits that could hide almost anything. They spread out in a line, each person responsible for a 50-foot section of the wash. The work was methodical, exhausting, and heartbreaking, turning over rocks that might conceal evidence, probing sand deposits that could hide tragedy. By noon, they'd covered nearly a quarter-mile without finding anything more significant than rusted mining equipment and sun-bleached cattle bones. It was Chen who saw it first, a glint of metal barely visible beneath a pile of flood debris near a massive boulder. "Over here," she called, her voice tight with emotion. Rodriguez joined her, and together they began clearing away years of accumulated sediment and organic matter. What emerged made his breath catch in his throat. The distinctive teal and silver paint scheme of a late-model minivan, its roof crushed flat by the weight of rocks and time. "Jesus," one of the volunteers whispered, stepping back as if the discovery was too sacred to approach. Rodriguez felt the familiar mixture of triumph and sorrow that came with solving a case that had haunted him for over a decade. They'd found the Michaels family's van exactly where Chen's analysis had predicted it would be. The vehicle sat wedged between two boulders, positioned by floodwaters with the random violence that characterized flash floods in desert canyons. The license plate was still partially visible beneath the debris. Colorado tags that matched the registration for the van David Michaels had loaded with camping gear and hope 13 years earlier. "We need to call this in," Rodriguez said quietly. The recovery team worked with the reverence due to a tomb. Sheriff Patterson, now gray-haired and weeks from retirement, supervised as specialists carefully excavated around the van that had been buried for 13 years. Each shovelful of debris removed was another page in the final chapter of the Michaels family story. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the county coroner, approached the vehicle like an archaeologist uncovering sacred artifacts. Through the cracked rear window, she could see personal belongings preserved by the dry canyon air, a child's stuffed animal, water bottles, and camping gear that spoke of a family prepared for adventure, not tragedy. The positioning suggests they were trying to escape the rising water, Martinez explained to Rodriguez and Chen, who watched from a respectful distance. The van was swept downstream and wedged between these boulders during the flash flood. Inside the vehicle, investigators found evidence of the family's final days that painted a picture of faith sustained even in desperate circumstances. David's Bible lay open to Psalm 23, its pages water-stained but readable. Sarah's journal, protected inside a plastic bag, contained entries that chronicled their growing awareness of danger and their determination to trust in God's plan. Day 3, Chen read from the journal's final entry, her voice barely steady. "The children are scared, but David keeps reminding us that we're not alone. We've been singing hymns together. Emma knows all the words to How Great Thou Art now. Luke fell asleep holding his bear and David's hand. The forensic team found other details that revealed the family's character in their final moments. They'd rationed their water carefully, shared their remaining food equally, and created a makeshift shelter using sleeping bags and camping equipment. David's final sermon notes, scrawled on the back of a gas station receipt, spoke of finding God in the wilderness and trusting in divine providence even when circumstances seemed hopeless. Most heartbreaking was the evidence of their last night together. The family had arranged their sleeping bags in a circle, holding hands as they faced the rising water that would sweep their van downstream. Emma's devotional book was found clutched against her chest, while Luke's bear remained exactly where his small hands had placed it. They didn't panic, Martinez said quietly. They faced it together as a family with dignity and faith. Rodriguez wiped his eyes, understanding finally that some mysteries once solved become even more profound in their revelation of human courage. The sanctuary of Mountain View Community Church was filled for the first time in years. She couldn't. Months after the discovery in Dead Horse Canyon, the congregation had finally gathered to lay the Michaels family to rest with the dignity they deserved. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across faces that had waited over a decade for this moment of closure. Pastor James Keller stood at the pulpit where David Michaels had once preached, holding the water-stained Bible that searchers had found in the van. David sought God in the wilderness, he said, his voice carrying across the packed sanctuary. What he found there wasn't the peaceful retreat he'd planned, but something far more profound, the strength to face the impossible with faith intact. Mark. Michaels sat in the front pew, his face showing the peace that comes only after long suffering has finally found its end. Beside him, Betty Hartwell wept openly for the first time since the family's disappearance, her tears washing away 13 years of guilt and unanswered questions. In the back of the church, Rodriguez and Chen sat together, their role as amateur detectives transformed into something more meaningful. They had given this community what professional investigators couldn't, the truth that allowed proper grieving to begin. The mystery that had haunted Mountain View for over a decade was finally solved, not through advanced forensics or official channels, but through the persistence of two people who refused to let the dead remain lost. Chen had framed Sarah's final journal entry, the one that revealed the family's last night together. The words spoke of faith sustained in darkness, of children comforted by parents who chose hope over despair, even as floodwaters rose around them. It was a testament to the power of love and belief in circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits. After the service, the congregation filed past 4 simple caskets draped in white, each decorated with photos from happier times. Emma at her piano recital, Luke building Lego castles, Sarah and David on their wedding day, the whole family laughing. Together in their backyard, the Michaels family had sought God in the wilderness and found him there, not in the peaceful retreat they'd planned, but in their final hours together when faith was all they had left. Their story had become part of the church's legacy, a reminder that sometimes the greatest miracles aren't rescue from suffering, but the grace to face it with dignity intact. Outside, the Colorado mountains stretched toward heaven, still keeping their secrets, but having finally released one family back to the love that had never stopped waiting for them to come home.